Hello and welcome to an introduction to ecology and biosphere. This is going to be our 10-minute wrap-up. Basically, we're looking at ecology that integrates all areas of biology together. We're going to be looking at the interaction between organisms and environment that will limit species distribution, and then we're going to talk a little bit about biomes and also the distribution of these biomes. And so, in effect, this is an introductory lecture. We'll be looking at kind of everything. In the next few lectures, we will be taking parts of these and going on and looking at them a little bit further. Basically, for this lecture and lecture series, you need to know what a population is. That is a group of species living in the same place at the same time. You do remember what a species is. A community is multiple groups of different species living in the same place at the same time. Basically, these organisms, whether they want to or not, interact with one another. And then ecosystems, we're looking at living organisms and their interactions with their environment. So all of us living things do interact with our environment because we need some things from our environment and we give things back from the environment. Ecology is basically, by definition, the scientific study of interactions between organisms and the environment and the distribution and exploitations of those organisms, and abundance of those organisms. Sorry, I messed up there a little bit. Environmental ecologists kind of ask a number of questions that relate to an organism, populations, communities, and ecosystems. Again, we'll be separating these in the next few chapters and taking a look at these a little bit further. But basically, in this introductory lecture, all you need to know about are the biotic and abiotic factors that affect growth of organisms. Again, we see an alpine tree here that's being greatly affected by its particular environment. Abiotic things that affect the growth and the distribution of organisms include temperature, water, salinity, sunlight, your rocks, and what your soil is, and what's going to be there. Again, in terms of climate, these global variations are going to be affected by air currents, water currents, the proximity of an organism to water, the seasonal variations, and your landscape features. These are all things that you need to be able to discuss or identify in class. I wish this wouldn't come up as much. Again, you need to be able to know the effects of sunlight on climate, and you need to be able to, these are all different things that we will look at, and we'll get into those in further, So basically, your latitude will affect the sunlight intensity depending on the type of year. Again, the most intense sunlight will be at the equator. At either a higher or lower elevation, we will get a seasonal variation in sunlight intensity. In certain times of the year, we will have more and more intense sun. In certain times of the year, we will have less and less intense sunlight due to this difference. Again, the mountain shadow effect you should be aware of, and that as we get here in our particular neck of the woods over San Francisco, we get air flowing off of the oceans, which will collect moisture up over the oceans. As this water goes up and over the mountains, we will see a decrease in the amount of water that material carries, and then as it goes over the mountain, that air tends to warm up. It sucks the water out of its environment. And so in a mountain shadow, we will see, especially in the Pacific side, that the side that's facing the coastal area will tend to be a little bit wetter and greener, and the downwind side tends to be a little more desert-like as that air takes it off. Again, in climate change, we are experiencing climate change, and we will talk about that in subsequent lectures. But in order to look at climate change, we can do things like look at kind of what happens in the past. We did have a glaciation event roughly about 16,000 years ago. None of us were here for that particular event. But again, they can look at kind of remnants of those past populations and look at what they are. And again, here we're looking at the extent of the American beach, depending on kind of how much warming we would have. Again, biotic factors that affect where an organism lives includes the interactions with other organisms, predation, foodability, and competition. This is a classic food web that we see here where, again, organisms depend on many other organisms. How do we look at this dependence a lot of times? How do we do research? Besides looking at these things and seeing them feed on one another, we can do things like, again, sea urchin and limpet are both organisms that feed on seaweed, but we see that when both are present, that the seaweed amount is relatively low. However, we get rid of both limpets and urchins. We can see lots of seaweed, almost 100% coverage. But again, the major organism that is at work here is basically the urchins. When we only remove the sea urchins and we leave the limpets aren't able to eat enough of that seaweed to really kind of keep it in check. Again, when you look at why a species is in a certain area, there's a number of questions to ask, and this gives you basically a flow chart that we can look at. Again, if an organism can withstand the temperature and kind of everything else in a range and an amount of liquid, why is it not in that liquid? And there's a number of different questions that we do need to ask. For terrestrial biomes, I'm very interested in that you guys know what a chaparral is, what a deciduous forest is. We don't have very much savanna here. We don't have very much rainforest, but we do have some grasslands and desert, and so I think it's good for you to kind of know what those organisms are. Again, in looking at this area here, our chaparral is this little gray area, and we see this little box here, and this little Mediterranean area, and again in South America and these areas over here. So we tend to see it at 30 degrees plus north and south. You should have an idea of where that is. Again, in all these biomes, we can graph them on a graph that depends on annual mean temperature versus annual mean precipitation, and that tropical rainforests tend to occur in an area where you have a relatively hot temperature and where you have a relatively large amount of liquid. If that temperature is too low and you have a low amount of liquid, then you are going to have an Arctic or an alpine tundra. Aquatic environments, I do want you to know the parts that the photic zone, where we would see sunlight, where you're going to see algae, and then the pelagic zone, where you're not going to see that as much. And so the zonation of a lake and the zonation of a marine environment. Again, you should be able to tell me how turnover occurs in lakes as opposed to the oceans. And again, lakes that are in temperate areas where we would have a cold winter and a warm spring tend to have a turnover in nutrients in their aquatic biomes. Estuaries and intertidal zones that are in the